Welcome to the Caffeine stream on caffeine and philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine stream. My name is C. Robertson. And in light of current events in the Middle East with, conflict between Muslims and Jews in particular, I thought the most appropriate thing would be to talk about more religion, but a completely different one. So I am joined today by Lilith to talk about Druidry. Now, what is your background with who are you, and what is your background with Druidry and religion in general?
Awesome. So I am legally Lilith. I changed it when I was like 19. I'm going by Awen these days, but honestly, don't care either way. I've been practicing Druidry for over 10 years at this point. Um, there's such a back. I mean, I've studied and I like to sort of use is the right word, traditional witchcraft, in that sort of like heretical British trad sort of sense. I'm fond of the American folkloric version of that for any of the snobs out there that can tell the difference. It's drawing from a similar kind of wellspring. And for the record, I was snorting when you were sort of introducing the Middle East thing, not because it's funny, but because I'm actually half Persian and like people have different opinions on that. So, anyways, um, uh,
Well,
let's
as a thoroughbred British Islander obsessed with the Greeks, we're both sort of in the wrong part of the world, I suppose. But that doesn't stop us
totally.
anyway. So it's the days of the internet.
Yeah, and that's the idea,
Yeah.
honestly. So like I love to see I like Druidry, and I've been drawn to it for years because I see it equally as a methodology and a religion.
Mm.
So I mean
So
I'm a
it's
little
not
bit getting ahead of it, but yeah.
so it's not tied specifically to Ireland, but the process of it. So
Yeah.
perhaps we could dive into that. As you've been
Yeah.
at it for a while. What is Druidry? Is it just Wicker Man, human sacrifices, and like Lorena McKennitt soundtracks, or like what is Druidry um actually?
I wish it was. I think it'd be banging if that was what Druidry was. As I've said many times, human sacrifice gets a bad rap, is vastly misunderstood and not employed enough. But be that as it may, that is not the case of Druidry today or for quite some time. Uh, there are many party poopers who think that it should never have been involved. I think that's lame. Okay, when that happened, it was because it was during times of war, and they were honestly not doing any worse than executing what we would consider war criminals, people that are trying to annihilate their entire culture. Um, Fuck them. You're gonna kill them anyways. You might as well bring the community together and honor the gods about it. I truly don't see the problem. So
Okay,
that's my
so
first comment.
the Wickerman style human sacrifices were more like public execution, but with more religious ritual than like civic ritual.
I would say so. So like, and that
Okay.
kind of, so that really speaks to I uh obviously like to see history as a trampoline, not a restraint system, but historically speaking, the Druids wore many, many hats. They were seers, they were shaman, which people tend to be the most familiar with that. But they were also the ones who were both scholars of the law and enforcers of it. They took on lawyerly type roles. They were really leading the community in a lot of ways, and they were mediating conflicts both within the community and sort of between their tribe or what have you, and outside society. So yeah,
So then the druids, and by druids we mean sort of the leaders in this world, were religious leaders and also political and social leaders.
totally.
Okay.
There's some really like entertaining. It's called Brian law. There were some of the laws that were sort of continued after the sort of time of the Druids had passed, largely speaking. And there's even stuff like if a husband does not satisfy his wife in certain ways, he can be charged a fine and publicly prosecuted. Which again, I don't see a problem with it. So they were they were doing a lot of different functions, and that's something that appeals to me about it is they don't explicitly say this, but what I've sort of gathered from the path is that capability is a sacred duty, and the ability to have many skills and to cultivate them and just generally make yourself more capable is part of what makes you able to walk that path of mediating, you know, us as people, and then the gods, nature, spirits, and ancestors. Just sort of
So,
the 3
am
points.
I
Yeah.
understanding you correctly then that the Druids, in their dual sort of amphibious role between religion and civics, were not just leaders in those two spheres, but were sort of models for a more integrated skill set for the individuals, rather than the other individuals' society, rather than just like specialization like you'd see in perhaps our society.
Totally. And I think that that's one of the reasons that it was really a lifelong path. And whatever people want to call it, I would say you're dedicating yourself to being priesthood of sorts at some point, even if it's not like our modern idea of like stand in front of people and pontificate.
Okay. Well, I think from our society and from recent history that most Americans might be familiar with, and people from whatever other country happen to listen to this, can understand maybe what political skill looks like, social skill, the local civic stuff. But the Druidic religion seems a little different than modern contemporary monotheistic traditions, or sort of the civic religion we have today. What was the Druidic religion like exactly? This is actually something I don't know a ton about. My vague understanding is that it's loosely polytheistic, but that there were a few key gods, and perhaps some groups might have been henotheistic, which is they like believe in a lot, but they have one primary one that they're like is their town's god, or maybe their personal god or something.
Sure.
Would it be something in that direction?
Well, so the best that I would say or maybe anyone can really do is sort of set a foundation of, okay, here's what we know based on the very limited history and interpretable, if that's a word, archaeology and sort of oral traditions and fairy tales and what have you. We can sort of give a shoddy foundation of like, yes, we know that for whatever polytheist means, they did have many gods. If you sort of study what little we do have, it seems like there were 3 points of veneration in the Druidic worldview, which would be gods, nature spirits, and ancestors. Those seem to be the primary points of focus. Um, and we get little hints through things like they had a taboo against writing down religious knowledge or any knowledge. Actually, there was a big emphasis on experience. So that's why I see historical Druids as, they put themselves at that crossroads. They sort of put themselves in the eye of the storm of like mediating between divinity in that sort of Trinity sort of sense.
So
That's a way to start it.
if they weren't writing things down, what was it of was there like an oral tradition that filled in the gaps, or was it pure experience, like the greatest people were elevated and they had to sort of redo the wheel every time?
So for when, gosh, I mean, I can't say exactly what century they started, right? But some people sort of agree on like second or third. Uh, the general idea of how Druidic training went, is you had these sort of 3 phases of what you would call Bard, Ovate, or Vatus, and Druid. And so you weren't, ideally, at least who knows, um, in its heyday, people were not reinventing the wheel every time, even though there's a great TV show called Britannia where it seems like that's happening. But yeah.
Okay, so if the bard is like the initiatory first level into becoming a druid, then it sounds like knowing the stories is sort of the foundation level. Were stories and knowledge of the stories sort of I don't know how to ask that question. That's sort of like the foundation for the religious path, rather than certain. I'm sure there are certain rites and things as well, but
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it really like a lot of the premise of it is that your knowledge of myth informs your magic. It's sort of that idea of like myth and ritual being 2 sides of the same coin, and that experience directly feeding into each other.
Okay. It informs their magic. Okay, so like in a Christian or Jewish or Muslim context, the role of the priest is to sort of shepherd people, to guide people in better relationship with God. And in the Christian and Muslim world, that's not even necessarily for the benefit in the here, but in the afterlife. But it was the religious role of the Druid, for the benefit of the souls of the individual, or was it more temporal in society, like making sure the crops were doing okay and the health of the people physically and that kind of thing, if we're talking magic?
I don't think there's that distinction really being drawn.
Okay.
Um, I think so those things are all kind of connected. There's not really, it's definitely a heavily animist type worldview where everything is imbued with soul. And that's part of why when you get into the mystical elements of it, there is a decided like lack of separation between like, our skin and soil is like the flesh of the earth. Like there's more of a direct connection. So all of those things, the reason that our magic works in that world too is because of that sort of lack of separation.
Okay. Interesting. And so there are a lot of different views on magic, and probably some truth to those different views. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some magic is like literally botany and agriculture, and other
Right.
magic is like the use of words to manipulate other people. Do we have any kind of idea of what druidic magic was like? Maybe some combination of both of those, or was it more social in their civic and story oriented background?
So I will do my best to answer that. Is your question more like, are you looking at more so at form or function, like at the sort of methods or like what they were trying to achieve?
I guess what I'm wondering is like what was druidic magic like? If we know. It's very possible we don't know, especially from oral traditions that are very easy
Sure.
to lose, like the Eleusinian mysteries, and doubtless many other oral traditions that we don't even know we lost because we wouldn't know we lost them.
100%. But yeah, okay. So basically, from what we do know of it, um, it is safe to say that a lot of the ritual magic specifically that we know the Druids did was heavily seasonal. And if you kind of look at the themes of like, okay, we're getting more introspective during the dark times, we're fighting and fucking and eating when the sun is out, and there's kind of observations to be made from that of like, all right, this isn't just like, okay, we hope the crops grow so we don't die. This is, we're observing that sort of same journey in the individual human spirit, for lack of a better word, of like, okay, we also get more like, okay, the crops are uh desolate and barren or whatever during certain months, and we also are kind of need to go more internal. I think it's correlating the sort of journey of the earth with and seasons and what have you, not to sound like a fucking hippie, with
Okay. So
individual
you,
people.
so you talked about the non-separation between the skin and the soil, the interconnectedness. So would it be fair to say then, from your description, that the Druids used ritual to maintain that connection for their people, for their tribe, in a collective kind of sense, or perhaps an individual sense in some cases?
I would say to maintain that and also just generally to sort of feed that life force, because that's the commonality, I think, is like this veneration of the current of life itself. And we see that expressed in the natural world and in ourselves and in the gods and what have you. So it's to maintain that connection and also to, I think, to just continue to feed it.
Okay. Okay. Um, Interesting. Uh, Something I've been thinking about a little bit recently, maybe you might have an interesting answer here, is pertaining to ritual then. Um, would you say that the rituals in Druidry are primarily means to accomplish some end? Like I do a ritual to achieve a certain result, or are they more like ends in and of themselves? Like we do the ritual for the sake of the ritual, or like we accomplish other ends so that we can do the
Right.
ritual. Is it, or maybe some are one way and some are the other.
I think it leans more of the latter and sort of the changes that you undergo as a person and whatever else you're changing at the same time, whatever you're doing on the realms, as it were, because there is a sort of like shamanic travel element. And I have a personal elder mentor who's very picky about the way the word shamanism is used. I am using it broadly to talk about like traveling between realms and what have you. The way that it changes you and the work you do while you're doing that, that does affect an outcome that you're going for, but it's also, it is more, it's so experiential, and uh it's about the journey for sure.
Okay, that's fair. That makes sense. And the rituals sort of either facilitate or at the very least mark certain milestones along that journey. The most famous of which, the most universal probably being, a funeral,
Right.
as the final milestone, at least on this side of the veil. But weddings and coming of age and anniversaries, births, things like that all seem
Right.
interesting too. Well, interesting. That's
Though, real quick before I forget,
mhm.
I don't want to speak too decisively on that either, because like, to mention human sacrifice again, like that was very much, I think that was fucking war magic. I think that was them explicitly trying to push back against, the Romans. Like, so obviously, I think that's why I tend to see it like that was the exception, not the rule. They weren't just, in my opinion, I don't think they were out here just eating people for its own sake. But, you know, desperate times, like there's definitely times where you're going to use what you do have. And I think for the most part, the rule would be, yeah, like we're uh en- hopefully enjoying, but like honoring the passage of time. And then there's others where you're like, yeah, we're at war. Like we have enemies, we have things we need to get done. So it's more just like, what is life calling for at that period of time?
Small digression, because just the phrase war magic is so fun. But it reminds me, there's the story out of China of which was like the bloodiest part of the world for like most of medieval history. But there was this general who was going up against another general, and he enlisted a bunch of convicts, and he said, hey, if you do this role, this special operation, so to speak, I'll
Hmm.
take care of your families for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And so he got a bunch of volunteers from the prison, had them dress up as soldiers, and when the armies faced off against each other on the battlefield, the first rank on his side all stepped forward, so they were like within, like you could see the whites of their eyes of the enemies, and they all in unison drew their swords, and on
Hmm.
command they all slit their own throats right in front of the enemy.
Baller.
And like the psychological trauma of seeing that is kind of hard to understate. So I don't know if the Celts managed to outdo the Chinese,
Oh,
but
I can do you
you can
almost as good
imagine
as that.
the Wicker Man would be pretty intimidating. I would if it was for
Sure.
that role.
There's the Wicker Man, there's a cannibalism, which again, I just support, let's be honest. What I really enjoy is Lord
Uh,
forgive me, I can't remember the name of the exact tribe, but some of the Celtic tribes went into battle but naked. Like
mhm.
completely. Then there's some like
Like
speculation.
skyclad.
Yeah, there you go. Modern pagan terminology. Completely skyclad, screaming. There's a sort of a similarity with like the whole berserker thing of like they're eating their own shields and are naked and whatever. But supposedly the belief was that they wanted to sort of go directly into the other worlds, because that was something that was apparently infamous with the Romans, that the Celts were fearless of death because they didn't see it as the end. They're going to the other worlds and then they'll be reborn back here. But
Oh,
naked,
interesting.
quite potentially on mushrooms, fearless.
What I love about the naked into battle part was, the Celts were renowned around the entire Western world for their metalworking. Like a lot of the chainmail for southern parts of chainmail
Yeah.
was later, but the metal armor came from the Celts, and then they themselves often did not wear it into battle. It's just
It's a
amusing.
choice. Yeah,
Um,
it's a choice.
So, well, that says something a little bit interesting about their religion, though. Can you tell us anything about the Druidic view of the afterlife and reincarnation? Is there like a heaven and hell, or is there sort of a different kind of place? What was that like, if to
Sure.
the degree that we know?
Well, there's definitely no heaven and hell. Definitely not in the way that like we understand it today. It's generally speaking just the other world. The realm of the dead is also the realm of spirit overall. And there's like
Mhm.
some different facets of like, okay, there's more specifically the mountains of like fairy and like the she, like that's kind of its own thing. Um, but the dead are the dead. Like there's not like extra suffering necessarily in one place more than another, but their views on the afterlife, it's kind of interesting. That was another one of the commonalities where the Romans saw them uh as almost like kindred spirits intellectually, because they felt that their views on what is it, like transmigration of the soul were sophisticated enough to be similar to, I don't want to say like Socrates, I'm completely blanking, but they recognized a lot of the ideas because it wasn't just like random reincarnation. It's okay, you achieve whatever you're going to achieve in this life, you are almost reborn in the cauldron of the other worlds, and cauldron symbolism is everywhere.
Mhm.
um and then you achieve what you're going to achieve in that life, and then you come back here. So obviously we don't know, there's only so much like written information we have. Um, but I find that's what I find really interesting about all of it is like the realm of the other world is dictated more than anything else by honor. Um,
Hmm.
and you're sort of, there's not a heaven or hell, but just like what you can glean from the lore is you're not done sort of testing and proving your virtue. Some of my favorite myths
Yeah.
are about the Lord of the Otherworld, who one of his areas of expertise, I guess, or his domain is honor and keeping your word. So you would call on the Lord of the Otherworld to sort of witness any like an oath that you would make, for example, if you were so
Interesting.
inclined. So
Yeah.
other people called Bridget and stuff.
It is fascinating from the Hellenic side that I mean, who knows how widespread this view was, but Plato concludes the Republic with a story of a man who jumps off his own funeral pyre, coming back to life, having seen the underworld, and how the story was how the dead are spend some time there, but
Yeah.
are draw lots for the who gets first choice in their next life, the bodies that they will inhabit in their next life.
Hmm.
And the idea is that your your virtues in previous lives don't dictate which body you get, but sort of dictate which body you're likely to choose. So my
That's a way to
favorite
put it.
line is Thersites the fool chose the body of an ape for his next life.
Mm.
And it's not that he's being punished in his next life in like a karmic
Yeah.
sense. It's like, no, his own foolishness caused him to choose the foolish choice.
Okay.
Um, and I always thought that was a clever and funny explanation and sort of theological case for living a virtuous life. Doesn't get around the question of like what is the most desirable, but at least gets you
Mhm.
sort of thinking in that direction. So if that's more like virtue oriented, honor seems very closely related to that,
Mhm.
perhaps in some way. So
Oh, like
interesting.
100%. And there's a ton of rabbit holes that I will spare you for the moment.
Well, I mean, rabbit holes can be fun, especially if we're already in the ground. Maybe not with rabbits, but um, so
Ideally, yeah.
interesting. And now one of the big subjects of contention pertaining to gods of the underworld or otherwise um, is in the pagan world. There's a lot of disagreement and consternation over, are the gods true? Are the gods real? Do they really exist like physically, or are they real things? And I
I
mean,
love this question.
my best guess, yeah. Well, what's the druidic view on that, if there's a singular one?
Um, well, definitely not a singular one. I am super anti-consensus. I think that it's, if there's anything
Excellent.
Yeah, there's anything more counter to the pagan spirit, it's agreeing. But oof, you know what? Remind me of the question one more time. Oh, the what are the gods and how quote real are they and such like.
Mhm.
Um, okay, I'm gonna say that at least this Druid's perspective and what I've kind of gathered and from talking to everyone who will talk to me in the modern Druidic world for the past few years, the gods are I put this as respectfully as possible, highly concentrated forms of energy. They're
Mhm.
definitely not, they're not real in the sense that people are real. They are not physically, literally real. I think that's actually pretty important to say that they are not literally real. They are real in the sense of they occupy a different domain. Like they don't, I think this is sort of why, like, this part is definitely canonically Druid, if there is such a thing. There are multiple realms, and the one that we're on, there's a reason that we do ritual. We are attuning ourselves to a different state of mind. We are changing the quality of our spirit, in a sense, to better interface with the gods because, you know, they might visit sometimes, but they are not corporeal in the way that we are. But that doesn't make them any less real. It's just like you're not gonna take a picture of one. Like you're not gonna, I really dislike applying a hard scientific or like literalist lens to something that it's not that domain,
Mhm.
if that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the language surrounding truth and reality are centered around, um, you know, what is physical, what science
Right.
can demonstrate. And of course, the Neoplatonists would take great umbrage with that. They would say, no, ideas are more real than physical matter. And certainly some Christians who follow from that Neoplatonic school might agree as well. But I mean, we were just talking before about the realm of the dead. And while the
Mhm.
dead are, I mean, physical in the sense that their remains are still in the ground or wherever, um, the idea of the dead, the ancestors, is sort of not physical. The
Right.
identity of the ancestor transcends the, decaying carbon over in that one plot of land.
Yeah.
So
It's
interesting.
interesting to me because it's funny how so many people that like, you know, the idea of paganism you would think is, you know, not being overly literalist and supposedly we don't like fundamentalism, right? Except when it comes to our own shit. And then suddenly, you know, people have a hard time uh, understanding the difference between sacred truth and mythic truth versus like, okay, you know, I need to pick up my dog poop. Like there's a dead dog in my backyard. Like those are not real in the same way. But I didn't think that's what we were doing here. You know, like I thought there's a reason that humans come back to ritual and to tell stories around fires and like to do all that. That is more than just like routine. So
Yeah, it's reaching for a truth that is in perhaps in some way aspirational, or perhaps in some sense like a Platonic truth, or as you were describing before, something that is binding from across another realm, whatever that realm might be, perhaps something difficult to describe. It's hard to, yeah, it's hard to, I mean, perhaps there's a reason why we call physical reality mundane etymologically. It is
precisely.
not, it doesn't feel particularly transcendent in the way that religiously unites people. Um,
Completely. And
but
I honest, uh-huh.
oh no, go ahead. I was going to use a tangent to change the subject slightly, but
Oh, you know, I
go
mean,
ahead.
it's semi-related. So I'm fond of this is something else I think it could benefit. This is why I appreciate your philosophical sort of bent. I think it would benefit modern pagans to read more than just like what's immediately quote relevant. Like, okay, here's something that somewhat like fucking Silver Ravenwolf in the 90s, like, you know, potentially pulled out of her ass. Like there's so much that's irrelevant to practicing as a pagan in the present that isn't just like, you know, here's the name of this god. And I specifically really like comparative mythology and the sort of like Jungian psych realm because they're talking about a lot of the same thing. I don't really care what you call it. And I really enjoy a lot of Mircea Eliade's work. And I think his, you know, sort of establishment of like the sacred and what he called the profane, I think it's more easy to just call it mundane, because that's really what he was talking about, is this sort of like practical, just sterile, uninterrupted day to day. To have a clear understanding of what sacred space is sort of crucial to understanding truth in a pagan sense of like, okay, if this isn't corporeally real, what makes it real? Like what's resonant about it? So I think to get into that sort of like comparative myth realm of study, like it can only benefit your practice.
Yeah, it certainly helps triangulate. Greg Naj has talked about the importance of being a comparatist, and Jack has talked about his exploration of the runes is like a lot of this was just made up. It's not the same as saying it's bullshit, but it is kind
Yeah.
of made up.
Yeah.
Very recently, like people are like doing rune bone casting, thinking they're doing something from like the Icelandic Middle Ages. Like, that's like 1950s.
Right. And that's where I think that's fine, because you
Right.
should be doing something that works and is real to you. But this is where, like, I think scholarship is important. I think it's crucial,
Mhm.
but you need to be able to, again, just distinguish, like, where do you get out of your armchair and do something
Right.
that feels real and is working and is doing something. And so, like, if you're doing something that kind of only fell into favor, like maybe 50, like Wicca only started being a thing in the 50s, that's fine. I just don't think that you should not be making the appeal to, oh, this is some uninterrupted, unbroken tradition. Like, the fuck
Right.
it is.
You don't
I
want
mean,
to
right.
have the delusion of like an ancient tradition. New things are fine. Every old thing was once new.
Right.
Um, so yeah, there's this kind of magic to making certain new things appear old, when they
Sure.
were perhaps not, and then before you know it, they're old, and but they got old by appearing old when they were new. Sort of an
And so
amusing
on.
situation, right?
Yeah.
But to backtrack a little, you were talking before about how there's something essentially pagan about disagreeing and defying consensus. Indeed,
Oh,
the
yeah.
Roman word paganus was like, the country bumpkin,
Heck.
basically these rednecks who don't follow urban convention. But
Yeah.
it sounds like the higher up druids did follow some kind of convention. That
Sure.
it sounds like there was some kind of hierarchy. How was there like a very rough outline to how druids were supposed to herd these cats in ancient society, or was the hierarchy kind of more of a loose thing than something more rigid in the like modern Catholic sense?
I think it's something to give you tools at the end of the day, because, and that's why I see it as both a religion, but also just a methodology. Because if you look at what we have of like, okay, here's how they worked magic and did ritual and sort of worked with their people, what I see is a lot of well energetically fed tools. So it's hard, honestly, to say how strict or not strict things might have been at a point in time. But I think it's more, it goes back to like learning how to think rather than telling you. It's not dogmatic, and that's kind of the point. There is no like 10 commandments. There are no, you, I understand it sounds somewhat edgy, but like you genuinely have to figure out what honor is for yourself, because that's something that I've kind of reflected on back and forth, especially because that's kind of a popular thing in like especially modern heathen circles, where it's like deeds not words and honor, and awesome. Like, I'm not making fun of it, but we like repeat things a lot, I've noticed, and sort of don't always put a ton of thought into what that means.
Yeah.
And if you look at, a lot of the Celtic myths, you'll see that, like, okay, honor is tied up in keeping your word, honor is tied up in living in alignment with your nature. There are times when it seems like the best course of action is to kill someone. There are times when it seems like the best course is, stay home and take care of your family. So I think it sort of ties back to like giving you tools and encouraging you to, I think that's why you have that sort of bard ovate druid thing, because it's giving you a foundation that you can make those kind of judgment calls, for yourself. And
Yeah.
that's what the path is.
And stories do give a better, you know, feeling of these ideals than just definitions. It was one of the great, I think, contributions George Orwell gave in his talk of politics in the English language about how these phrases can become stale and kind of lose their meaning over time, and you wind up with just kind of platitudes that can sound really empty, not just sound empty, but actually fail to convey the sense of the thing aspired for to people who just repeat the right words. So
exactly,
that story foundation is interesting, and it's something that seems to have fallen by the wayside just in the last 70 or so years, really, in our society. No, I don't know, maybe not. That could probably be debated, but we certainly don't have a foundation in stories to begin with in that way.
I think the longing for it remains, but definitely like there's a complete, I mean, this is what drives people to paganism, I think, a lot of the time is like a deeper longing to actually do something about that need for story and to bring story to life, which I think is what we're trying to do a lot of the time. When there is a we.
Right. Well, and I think there is, in the sense of unified, pursuit of something sacred, that is not, monotheistic and rigid and urban in nature. But that leads me to, and it is getting a little late, but there's a whole other world here to explore, which is, what is the in the pursuit of this way of life in these stories, there is a modern world of Druidry. There are like institutions and groups and stuff that you've been a part of and active within. What is that like? Is there like a ton of people, or is it like, several hundred kind of holding the line against time, or and yeah, like what is that world like, I suppose?
Sure. So a lot of modern Druidry, like in terms like organizationally, heavy emphasis on modern. Some of this stuff is like less than Wicca is older for sure. They're definitely ancient in that way. I've been part of Arnrios Fane, or ADF, which is an American Druid Fellowship, since I was 17. So roughly about 10 years. And it's, I will say something. There's another group called Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, OBOD. The only reason I'm not more involved is because they don't have much of a physical presence in my area. And that's my primary draw to working with groups, is just getting out of my house and doing things in real life. But ADF, it was created sometime in the 70s by, I want to say, Isaac Bonowitz. And its strength is really in trying to create just a workable, for one, ritual outline, for two, just sort of like study programs of like, all right, here's like what you can read to give you an idea of what the lore generally is. And ADF is even, their reach is a lot more loose than my personal one is, because their cultural wellspring, I guess, is just broadly Indo-European. They'll pull that, like, you can do ADF rituals with like as long as the culture is Indo-European, it can still be ADF. Me, that's a little bit too much.
Yeah. That's extremely broad, but it sort of goes back to your point about it being more of a method than a particular pantheon or set of ancestors, or even particular set of stories, although some of these stories go back quite a ways. So
right. And that's where I think you kind of briefly touched on like henotheism. You can definitely like choose to go that route and still be a druid and be well within like druidic magic. I have about as many personal gods as I can handle. I think I have around 5, so definitely that's not me. But you easily could. And actually, people, like, I sort of love this lately. Like, people like to ask this question of if you can be Christian and pagan, or if you can incorporate Jesus in some way, as if people haven't been doing that for a very long period of time already, like as if the Celtic Church wasn't directly responsible for carrying over a lot of Druidic traditions to begin with. Anyway, so yeah, you you can you can apply that so many different ways.
Interesting. So there are a few ragtag groups sort of trying to establish some baseline canon that can give people sort of a springboard to advance and do their own thing. But I mean, with the ideal being a kind of contextually specific and like unified in your expertise across a number of different domains, ideal, you would expect a fairly low level of organization, I think.
Yeah, it's a fucking nightmare.
Like libertarians,
It's very much like libertarians. I mean, the strength of it is it gives you, for one, like the groups that do ritual in real life, great. I see them, to be totally honest, it's community gatherings with a scholarship base. Like there's sort of like in ADF, it is kind of cool. There are specific guilds that like you can go on your own self-study programs, and like once you do a certain level of writing and meditation, like it gives you some guidance as like, all right, you don't have to do things this way, but if you do, you will engage in a deeper way. So my personal, where I sort of like, I appreciate them, and I think that they should continue to like be a thing and provide community for people. It just, you're never gonna get all that heavy with public, like fully open to the public rituals. Like that's, you can do a good amount, and I'm a fan of pushing it as much as possible because that is what we are here to do, in my view. But there's a limit, even with the most like receptive group.
Right, for sure. And that's sort of what you would expect with people who disagree with each other and
Yes.
want to develop themselves in their own way, which is, we wouldn't be in this space if we didn't find that admirable in the first place. So
you would hope so.
Well, cool. It's I'm going for a little while. I think we're hitting a nice closing spot, but before we go, is there one, places where people can go to read your material and check your stuff out, and B, places where they could go, perhaps the organizations you talked about before, where they could learn more about Druidry in these groups?
Absolutely. I'm trying to focus all my stuff at primaldruidry.com. My primary push is I've been doing monthly real life rituals for the past year or so. So I have my own group that's doing all of that, and workshops and what have you. But primaldruidry.com. I'm for now Outlaw Priestess on Instagram. I'm trying to change it to Primal Druidry, but it's mundane reasons. So I highly recommend the groups that I mentioned. You can just look up ADF, Druidry, or OBOD. Out of ADF, I love Ian Corrigan. I flew to Ohio to meet him primarily. And he's like very big on the trance element of ritual. So there's people getting up out of their armchairs that are worth listening to, in my opinion.
Very cool. Well, awesome. This has been fascinating, and I think I have more stuff to read now. So anyways, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the questions.